Grief, trauma, and shock. At some point in our lives, we're going to be faced with one of those. In this episode of Not Just Yoga, I'm talking again to homeopath Victor Cirone about these subjects. He offers a very interesting case study which puts things into perspective. He also offers some remedies that we can use, have them in our first aid kit, and some other interesting information. I hope you find this useful. Thank you for tuning in. Also, if you see below, you can see that there are chapters. Maybe there's something in the chapter headings that really catches your eye, where you can just go straight there and have a look. Just in case you didn't know. Thank you. Well, hello, Victor, and thank you again for joining me on Not Just Yoga.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to deepening our conversation on homeopathy.
Yeah, well, after our last conversation, I had people contacting me saying that they wanted to study homeopathy. They found it so interesting.
That's good. We need more homeopaths, so.
After our last conversation, what we didn't get round to, and what I was very interested to discuss with you, was trauma, grief, and shock. So you very kindly agreed to do that today, and you've also proposed an actual case study which could help us a little bit more understand what you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll talk in general about what the homeopathic approach to trauma is, which is quite different than the psychotherapeutic approach. Because fundamentally, and this is, I think, a very important point to start with, where in homeopathy, the trauma in and of itself is actually not as relevant as the individual's reaction or response to that trauma. And we can start with a very simple example, a made-up hypothetical example that I tell to my patients sometimes. So imagine you have two people driving in a car and they get into a traffic accident, and the driver gets out and starts smashing his fists and screaming and shouting and throwing things. And the passenger starts shaking and sobbing and crying and is going into a state of panic. So you have the same event, objectively the same event that these two people experienced, but the reaction to it is completely different, which is to say...
I was just going to say they could even shut down completely.
Yeah, they could even shut down completely. So you could have a total polar opposite reactions. And so
Yeah.
the thing that's important, and obviously this is a relatively minor event. Of course, there's a dimension of time that also factors into understanding and working with trauma, because the time factor is also very important. The degree of repetition of an event does determine the extent to which the trauma does shape the way that a person is. But fundamentally, the point that I want to convey with this is that the way that the person is in a sense already determined. Yeah. And what the trauma does is it elicits or brings to the surface already innate patterns that are there in the personality. So this is, I think, an important point to differentiate with psychotherapy, because in psychotherapy, in most schools of psychotherapy, the idea is that basically we are essentially born into the world as a kind of a blank slate, and that various things then happen to us, early childhood experiences, formative experiences, that then shape us and make us who we are. Yeah, based on the care that we were given or not given, and all of these things that happen in life. In homeopathy, it's the opposite belief. It's the belief that a person is actually born with an innate state already, an innate constitution, an innate disposition, which is in a kind of germinal phase. And of course, it will develop according to certain situations and circumstances in the environment. But there is actually an innate patterning of experience and of personality and of susceptibilities towards certain kinds of diseases that's always already there. And so when we're dealing with trauma from the homeopathic perspective, the most important thing is not so much the details of the event, but specifically how the event triggers or brings up certain patterns of reactivity in the person, because then those patterns of reactivity actually then point to and suggest an underlying, you could say, constitutional level that we're actually trying to treat in homeopathy, rather than the event itself.
Is that related to the miasm that you spoke to in our previous conversation?
Well, miasms can be related. I mean, there are miasmatic patterns of inheritance that certainly come through and that are part of the innate makeup of the person. Yeah, but there are additional features, and it's not only something that is inherently negative. It's also certain attributes and qualities. Yeah, it's like the seed of a plant. Yeah, every plant has its own seed, and that seed in and of itself is singular in terms of its identity. You can't have an apple seed and have it turn into a pear. Yeah. But what
Yes.
does make a difference is that if the apple seed is placed in a hostile environment where it doesn't have the proper conditions to grow and thrive, then it won't really bear fruit. Yeah. So from the homeopathic perspective, the apple remains the apple, irrespective of the circumstances that it's put through. What change what so fundamentally, when we're dealing with trauma, we have to always try and understand actually still who is the person that is experiencing the trauma and what is their unique pattern of reactivity to that trauma, rather than we don't say have a remedy for domestic violence or a remedy for sexual abuse or a remedy for this or a remedy for that. Still, we always only have remedies for individual people who experience certain events, and then the pattern of reactivity, how they react, how they respond to the event, is fundamentally what is being treated, rather than focusing on the event itself,
Yes.
tends to be what the psychotherapeutic approach is, and what ends up happening. And this can be useful in certain situations, but fundamentally, when you mentalize an experience like this, then you can develop compensatory mechanisms, and you can say, oh, okay, well, I understand maybe perhaps what the motivation was here, or I understand why my parents treated me this way, or oh, they were just reliving patterns that they experienced. And so you develop a kind of compensatory mechanism. But fundamentally, it's a mentalized process rather than actually working on the level of the innate constitution of the person, so that they are able to evolve in a way such that those same stresses and patterns of experience don't affect them as deeply, so that their pattern of reactivity, and you can say their conditions to be okay, become more robust and more well established, and thereby the overall state of health of the person becomes more robust and more well established.
And they also get a chance to function better in the outside world, in their own life.
Exactly. And one final point on the psychotherapeutic approach. One of the things that Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy, said, and this was, really before Freud, but there were certain rudimentary kinds of talk therapy that were being employed at the time. But basically, he said that this kind of counseling, and the same applies to psychoanalysis and Jungian archetypal psychology and so on, is that fundamentally these therapies are very useful for addressing learned patterns of behavior, which is to say that, say, a person has been conditioned into a certain way of being or a certain way of thinking, and then they go into psychotherapy and they're made aware of those patterns. Yeah, so the learned behavior can become conscious, and so you're bringing an unconscious patterning or unconscious programming to the light of awareness, the light of consciousness, and thereby the person is able to change the way that they function. But if you're not dealing with a learned behavior, Hahnemann said that this kind of psychotherapeutic approach can actually, in many cases, make the situation worse. And you do find I've seen in practice where people that have been through a lot of psychotherapy, it can actually be somewhat difficult to get through to them because they have so many ideas and theories as to why they feel the way that they feel. Oh, it's because this happened. Oh, it's because that happened. Oh, it's because of this person and that person and this event and that event. Yeah. And the compensatory mechanisms are so strong that basically they're functioning as what Freud said the purpose of psychoanalysis was to create a healthy neurotic. Well,
Oh,
yeah,
right.
and so a lot of these people will go through years and years in psychotherapy so that they can become healthy neurotics, which, from a perspective of being able to function in the world, can be useful and helpful. But the aims of homeopathy are more noble than that, I would say.
Right. Well, I look forward to hearing that. I just want to go back to that idea that you were just talking about. I mean, what I understand is that if someone has gone through trauma, it's the emotional center that is hypersensitive, and so what the rational center is sort of reduced, I would say. So how can you rationalize, like you're saying that they've in psychotherapy they're saying it's because of this, it's because of that, but that sounds more rational than dealing with the emotional problems that occur from trauma.
Yeah,
So how does one deal with that?
yeah. Well, in homeopathy, it would be fundamentally to understand even the rationalization process. I mean, of course, there are some people that innately are more capable and more inclined to rationalize experiences in all kinds of different ways. Whereas, yeah, and so that already tells you something. If you have someone that is, if you say they've experienced a trauma and they come in and they're very much rationalizing their experience, that is already suggestive versus another kind of overly emotional reaction where, for example, a person is actually not able to even cognitively put together the pieces of what happened. Yeah, so it's already it says a lot about if a person has experienced a trauma and then they fundamentally they develop a rational defense mechanism against it versus a person whose rational center actually begins to collapse and crumble after traumatic experience. Again, that doesn't have to do with the event itself. It has to do with the innate patterning of experience of the person and how they react to the event. Yeah.
Well, maybe you could enlighten us on the case study that you had.
Sure. Yeah, we could go into the case now and then perhaps talk in a little bit more detail about some other theoretical points. So this is a case of a man in his 50s, and he was going through a prolonged divorce with his wife, and he has several children with her, and basically had quite a happy family life, but there were various issues that started to come through in the marriage, and mostly a kind of complete personality change in his wife that she started accusing him of various things, and basically, also becoming quite emotionally abusive towards him. And basically, he came in and he said, I feel sad, I feel alone, and I miss my kids and I miss my family. Now I just want to go to bed. I just want to watch TV. I don't feel like reading. I walk the dog. I play with him. And it's kind of it's a existence of essentially routine and drudgery that he's living through ever since he's moved out of the house. He's distant from his children. He sees the children once in a while, but the family connection is broken. And when he comes home from work, it's already dark, and this affects him because he leaves the house in the morning before the sun comes out, and he comes back and it's dark. So it's a very unsettling time for him. And he can experience quite significant and overwhelming attacks of anxiety during the day. And they often have to do with the whole situation that he's going through. And there is also a certain kind of ambivalence that he has towards his wife, because on the one hand, he feels a lot of resentment towards her, but then also he does say that he misses her. And he can't quite come to terms with how is this woman that I'm dealing with now, who's sending also quite disturbing emails to him and quite disturbing emails to members of his family and trying to turn his children against him. How is this woman the same woman that I fell in love with? So these are kind of the details, the background of the case. And so where do we go? What do we do? We have to try and understand. So then this is basically the situation, right? And so what we have to understand is fundamentally how he responds or how he feels to be in the situation, because the situation in and of itself is not something that we can prescribe on. So one of the things that he says that starts to lead to the remedy is that when he's at home, he doesn't really want to cook. He doesn't want to buy food to cook. He's unmotivated. And he says when he's having to do things around the house like cooking, it makes him feel like he's in a cage. Okay, so that is something that is unique to his experience. Right? I feel like I'm in a cage, right? So that's not everybody who's in this experience of basically living by yourself and having to cook and just having to gone through a divorce will feel like they're in a cage. Yeah, that's where we start to see the individualizing points coming through, because you could imagine that many people in this kind of situation will have completely different experiences. One person might say, I feel shattered. Right? That would be very different than feeling like you're in a cage.
No, some people feel like they're in a cage when they're in a relationship.
Yes, well, that too. Yeah, that too. That's the experience. Yeah, so that's where you start to individualize. You don't say, well, what is a remedy for a person who has been betrayed by his wife? There's no such remedy as that. It doesn't exist because it's a generic situation. So I asked him, I said, what do you mean being in a cage? He says, by myself, alone. Mainly, I feel alone. And he's very lonely. He feels by himself. He wants to turn to alcohol. And this was a problem earlier in the treatment when he was drinking, but he was able to overcome that. And then he says that he feels useless. What am I doing here? If I die, nothing's going to happen. My kids might even be happy. I feel alone. And he says, even if I was married, two of my kids are still leaving the house, they're going to school, and I would still be in an empty nest. So that's also an interesting expression. My kids are going to leave, and so even if I was still married, even if the family was still together, then I'm approaching a situation of being in an empty nest. So interesting, because it's a spontaneous expression, and this is another important thing. You don't try and elicit or suggest things to patients. So you would never say, for example, do you feel like you're in an empty nest? Yeah, if the patient had brought that
No.
expression up, you would never say it. You would never put phrases
Yeah.
or ideas or expressions in the patient's mind, because then you start to make a case rather than to understand the experience of the person.
Oh.
Yeah. So again, it's going back to feeling lonely, um, and yeah, that his purpose of living has changed, and he needs to accept that. And so he also then spoke about, because I asked him about previous relationships that he had been in, because this was a marriage that he had been in for a long time, but there were other relationships, and um, I was wondering if the grieving pattern was similar in previous relationships, and he said that in the previous relationship to his wife, he said, I did not have a proper grieving of that relationship, and so for 10 years I was grieving. So that is also very peculiar, because uh, to grieve over a relationship that actually fundamentally didn't end in a very traumatic way is quite unusual. I mean, you can understand that a person grieves for, a year or 2 years, but a decade is a long time to be in a state of grief about a relationship. So that has to be something that's innate to him. Yeah. It doesn't have to
Yeah.
do with the situation, because the circumstances around that relationship were not especially traumatic. Yeah, and then again, this feeling that he was saying of being in the empty nest when his children leave, it also speaks to something about the way that he processes loss and grief. Yeah, and then I asked him. It's also, so once you understand, you can say the patient's hell. Yeah, the hell that they're experiencing. It's also important to understand the heaven state. Yeah, the bliss state that they can, if it's to what extent it's accessible to them, when they feel at their best, what enlivens them. So you can get the opposites, and with a good remedy, you'll see that both states are explained by the remedy. And so he says that uh, freedom is to be out of the house, to go out in the park, close to nature and the trees, especially walking to the river. It's always nice to be by the river. I feel that the river is cleaning me, cleansing me, taking all of my karma, all of my loneliness, all of my worries. It's just, and he goes into a kind of moment of, you know, kind of tranquility that's beyond words. So here you can tell that he's going into a deep sensation level of experience. Yeah, it's not even something that he can verbalize, but he's going into that state. It's the opposite of the lonely emptiness state. Yeah, it's the bliss state. And he says it takes away all my karma, all my loneliness, all my worries. And he says it's a strong river. It rained a lot, and the sound of the river is so nice. It takes all of my past, and I am a prisoner of my past. I'm a prisoner of my memories. I'm a prisoner of a woman that doesn't exist anymore, his wife, because the ideal woman that he fell in love with, doesn't exist. She's turned into what he says is a monster. And he says that when I'm by the river, it's like I leave the present moment. I leave the cage. Yeah, what he described earlier as a cage, a restriction.
Yeah.
And he goes into a state of being free, what he calls the freedom of being outside of the house, especially being by the river, listening to the sound of the water. Then he's able to escape from the cage. Yeah, that's when he feels his at his best, and
But he's still alone.
he's still alone. Exactly. Yeah, he's still alone. Of course. Yeah. And he says, I've always liked the sound of the water. I knew that I would feel better there. So he goes there every day. It's something with the air and with the movement. I'm lucky to have the river so close. And um, basically, there's nothing else that really makes him feel well in this state. Otherwise, he feels caged when he's at home. He feels trapped in the situation. He feels like he's approaching this situation of the empty nest with his children. And there are, of course, other details in the case, but those are the key pieces that we need to make sense of. Um, of the case and to arrive at the prescription. So fundamentally, there are a few elements here that are worth discussing. So this was a case where this patient received an animal remedy, and you can say that in the animal kingdom, the fundamental experience across all kinds of animals, from the largest predators to the smallest prey, is that the experience is that someone is doing something to me. And it's fundamentally a question of survival. And the threat against survival has to do with someone who is doing something to me. Yeah, it's very different than, say, a mineral case where most of the problems in a mineral case have to do with I, me, mine. It's very self-referential. Yeah, it has to do with a feeling of lack or deficiency in the self, rather than a feeling that someone is doing something to me. Yeah, and in this case,
Yeah.
it was very much having to do with all of these problems. Fundamentally, had to do with his ex-wife, who was putting him in this situation, making him go through this hell. Yeah, it was by no means anything that was having to do with a feeling of lack in himself. It was, this person has caused this to happen to me. So we need an animal remedy, and we need an animal remedy that has something to do with the water. Yeah, um, because of course he feels best when he's at the water. Yeah, so that is, you can say, the expression, and he goes in again into that sensation state where he's talking about the water, how he feels at the water, and it's just a kind of silence. And he doesn't even have to say anything, because you can almost feel the experience of peace when he's talking about how he feels when he's at the river. So you know that there is something there deep in his state that is reflective of this condition of being at the water. Um, and also, then we have that key piece of feeling like you're in a cage, trapped. He
Yeah.
didn't say trapped, but it's basically the same expression, same sensation. And the opposite is to be free. So when we see that dichotomy of trapped and then free is the opposite, the hell and the heaven, then we're in the bird kingdom. So
That's what I thought.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we need a bird, and we need a bird that has something to do with the water.
Yeah.
And
Like the kingfisher.
almost. So I gave him a Cygnus oler, which is the mute swan. Yeah, and the swans. Yeah, perhaps we can include a photo, if you can edit a photo in, of two swans, because first of all, the swans are monogamous for life once they bond, and also it's you can't even make it up, but when you have two swans together, they put the heads together like this, and it makes a kind of a heart
Yes.
shape. Yeah.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, this remedy, the Cygnus oler, and there's a few different swan remedies. There's the whooper swan, Cygnus cygnus, which is a bigger swan, and so it can be more defensive. Yeah. Um, Whereas Cygnus oler is smaller and doesn't tend to be as defensive or as reactive. And so it's more in a state for a person who doesn't tend to be as reactive in this kind of scenario. Yeah, he's actually very passive in terms of how he was reacting and dealing with it, because he felt, in a sense, overpowered by the situation, defeated.
How long did it take you to get to the remedy?
Well, after this intake, it was very clear. We had tried a few remedies previously, but sometimes what can happen is, and this is, there's so many factors. Sometimes a remedy, and this was by far the remedy that helped this patient the most. Yeah, he had other remedies, and he was having the issues with anxiety, and he was having alcohol problems and other sorts of issues. Other remedies had helped kind of take the edge off, but fundamentally,
Yeah.
I wasn't able to get to this depth of the case taking until this point. And sometimes I can't help but wonder, because the elements of the case were so clear after that session, but they were not clear previously. And
Right.
so you can't help but wonder if there is actually something larger than just the intention of the person to get better, or the intention of the homeopath to find the correct remedy for the person. If there is a certain, you could call it a karmic element, or some unnameable dimension of the case, which determines the extent to which, or when, in the case, in the treatment process, the patient is actually going to really experience a remarkable transformation. And sometimes you have patients who come in who are in such an extreme state of crisis that the remedy is very clear right from the beginning because it's almost their destiny to receive the remedy at that time. But for
Right,
other
right.
patients, it's almost like they're not ready, or there's something that is preventing the remedy from showing itself right away. And of course, there are some times that is the fault of the homeopath who just can't perceive it. But there are other times that the information only really becomes elicited later on. And often in animal cases, this does tend to happen because there tends to be, in general across the animal kingdom, in animal cases, a certain hesitancy to open themselves up to the homeopath right away, to disclose all the details right away. Some animal cases more than others. Yeah, they tend to be more cautious. Yeah, because again, there's this sense of someone is doing something to me, or the other person is potential threat for me. Yeah, it's the experience in the animal kingdom, and so sometimes you can have less of a mm, less of a openness on the part of the patient, but not always. And it does also depend on the animal because, for example, to give an example of a another bird remedy, the macaw, the parrot, will be often very talkative. Yeah, and you'll just get, one sentence after the next, and it's almost hard to stop the patient because they're talking so much.
I know someone like that.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, that could be also plant sensation. So you have to have the elements there. There's lots of remedies could potentially be talking a lot, but then it's a question of, is what they're talking about having to do with fundamentally this theme that you see in the bird cases of trapped and freedom. That dichotomy has to be there. And if
Yeah.
that dichotomy is not there, then they're not in the bird kingdom, and the patient doesn't need a bird remedy. So yeah, just a few more things about this particular remedy. So the essence of it is that they're very emotional and very loving, and the problems tend to arise when they feel that they're not understood and treated badly. So this was very much what the situation of this patient was. He was not understood by his wife. She had a completely distorted perception of who he was. They had some disagreements about various things, but she took it of course, I never spoke to the wife, but so I'm getting his account. But she took it in a way that it was like he felt like she was a completely different woman who didn't have any means of understanding his experience anymore, and also being treated badly. Yeah, so he was being treated very badly by her, very cruelly by her. It was like that she had no regard for his well-being. So that's a core element, and you also see deep sadness. Yeah, so there's also something said about this remedy, the active survival of events over many years, which is also very interesting when he said that he was grieving the relationship, his previous relationship, for 10 years. Yeah, so we see a state of grief that has to do with the active survival of events over many years, and this is accompanied by a stunning and powerful sadness. So this is also a sadness that you see often where there is some kind of abuse. Yeah, often having to do with partnerships, relationships, and
And so do you then look at the developmental years at all?
the developmental years. Well, if a patient brings it up, yeah. So if a patient will bring things up, um, in general, it's important to talk about. But fundamentally, I find that when you start to do that, so say for example, a patient is, I mean, like say this patient is talking about his wife and the empty nest and the cage and all of these things. If I were to just then say, okay, well, why don't you tell me about what it was like for you as a child? And he spontaneously he doesn't go there at all. Then the patient then starts thinking, oh, okay, well, my childhood is important because the homeopath is asking me about it, so I should tell about it because fundamentally, if you're a patient and you're asked about something, then I understand that it's important information, so you start talking about it. But what you lose when you do that then is actually staying with the golden thread of what the patient is actually disclosing about what is actually important for them. Yeah. So if you have a patient who comes in with trauma of some kind and all they are talking about is their mother, and it's mom did this and mom did that and mom did this and mom wasn't there and mom was this and mom was that, then that's the territory. Yeah. And then of
Okay.
course you're going to be talking about it, but um, fundamentally, if a patient doesn't start talking about it, it's best not to go there. If there are hints and clues that it is an issue and you're wondering about something, then of course you can ask. But in general, it's best not to, get a person to go and rehash all the events of childhood, because then also, especially if a patient is familiar with psychotherapy or have been through psychotherapy, then they just start rehashing the theories that they've learned about their personality and
Right.
why they are the way that they are, and then you get stuck in the mentalizing process again, and then you lose the case, and then you start making a case rather than actually going into the elements of experience that are actually essential, which in this case was the dichotomy between being trapped in the cage and freedom, and the empty nest and the water. So you see that those elements, it doesn't matter in this case what the patient's childhood was like, because he doesn't talk about it. Yeah. He's talking about these
So,
experiential states that he's in now, and he doesn't relate it to his childhood, so there's no need to go there.
so what were the results that you got from this remedy
Yeah.
with your
It was
patient?
quite remarkable. His depression, and the anxiety, and also there was some insomnia. It all lifted, uh, very, like, very dramatically. He said, "I felt good ever since I took the remedy, like minutes after, and I've been feeling well ever
Oh,
since." And this continued. I haven't spoken to this patient in probably a year, but I followed up with him for about a year, and he took occasional repetitions of the remedy, just a few, and continued to be very well. And he developed greater resilience in terms of dealing with the situation. He didn't feel sad anymore. He got out of his depression. He's able to be at home and not feel like he was in the cage anymore. He goes home and does things. He plays with the dog. He picks up his kids. He's there for them in a way that he wasn't able to be there before. He's not feeling bad about himself. He's not having to go to bed so early because he's so depressed. And he also says that he feels more connected at work, more positive at work. And even around the holiday season, which he says in general he doesn't like, he was feeling good. So
that's really
yeah, it was
incredible.
great. It was a phenomenal reaction. Yeah.
And out of interest, what potency did you give him?
He took the 200C. Um, Probably now I would have given him 1M, but it didn't actually fundamentally make a difference. In this case, he took the 200C, and I think after about 6 months, I did give him a dose of 1M. Um, but yeah, and some in some cases the potency will make all the difference. You have the right remedy, but the potency is either too low or too high, and when you adjust it, then you get a very positive response. But in this case, it didn't make any difference. He had a very positive reaction to the 200C, and the 1M, when he took it, it basically was the same. It was the same thing. And to be honest, I don't even think he really fundamentally needed a repetition of the remedy, because this state never came back. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
So, Victor, I wanted to ask you, just while we're on this subject of remedies, is that if someone has decided to take conventional pharmaceutical drugs to help support them through
mhm.
life, is it possible that they can also take a remedy simultaneously, or do they have to come off that?
No, they can certainly take the remedies at the same time, and this is
Okay, that's
yeah,
good.
because fundamentally, and this is one of the great benefits of homeopathic treatment, because even when you're working with herbs, there are certain herbs, like for example, I mean, we spoke of antidepressants last time. When you're on antidepressants, you can't take things like St. John's wort, because it will start to interfere with the metabolization of the drug, and there's potential contraindications. So there's certain herbs that when you're on certain drugs you can't take them, even if they're actually well indicated in the case. Whereas with the homeopathic remedy, because we're dealing with an ultra high dilution, and it doesn't work on the physical chemical level in as direct a way as a herb does or as a pharmaceutical drug does, that there's no interference in terms of the mechanisms of action of a homeopathic remedy and a pharmaceutical drug. So, and you can't even see many situations in which, when you prescribe an appropriate homeopathic remedy for a patient, that the need for the drug becomes less and less and less and less. Say you're dealing with hypertension, or even something like depression, and that can be very useful if a person wants to get off of the drug that they're on, because then you have a baseline. So a person comes in and say they have, you know, raging hypertension, and you start them on treatment, and then it becomes, you know, significantly lower, and then you can say, okay, well, you can talk to the prescribing physician because your baseline now is much better. And so when you're able to
Right.
see with a good remedy that the complaints, even though the patient is still on the drugs, that the complaints are becoming better, or patients that are on antidepressants, many of whom are still severely depressed, yeah. And
Yeah.
this is another topic, but you know, one of the known effects of antidepressant drugs is increased feelings of depression and suicidality. So it becomes problematic to try and understand what's actually the experience of the patient and what's actually the drug that's playing
The
through
drug.
the patient's mind. Yeah. And so, but in those cases, still you have a baseline. So the patient is feeling a certain way. And so, with a good remedy, even if the patient continues exactly with the same dosage of the drug, then you have a follow up with them and you see that things are better. Then you know that you're moving in the right direction, and the patient can gradually start to talk to the prescribing physician about lowering the dose. Yeah,
Oh, that's good to
yeah.
know. Now, I mean, I did say that I wanted to discuss trauma, grief, and shock. So I was wondering if you could maybe give a little picture of how you recognize the difference.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, you can look at it in a number of different ways. Um, there is often when it comes to trauma, an experience of a time, the time dimension that's very important. I just want to find here a quotation from Piaget, who said something about the time dimension in trauma. It was essentially something having to do with the time dimension, the repetition and exposure to the traumatic experience is often a very decisive and important factor. Um, and this was also something that then, you know, Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, also emphasized. Oh, sorry, it was Pierre Janet, not Piaget. Very very similar names, but Pierre Janet, who was a forerunner of Freud, and from whom Freud actually, you could say, borrowed a lot of ideas from. But he said that traumas produce their disintegrating effects in proportion to their intensity, duration, and repetition. Yeah, I'll read it one more time because I think it's an important
Yeah.
quote. Traumas produce their disintegrating effects in proportion to their intensity, duration, and repetition. So those three factors are fundamental in the intensity of the event, right? I mean, you know, if there is, I mean, you can think of, I don't have to give made up examples, but you can think of a very intense situation that happens to a person. Yeah, and it's a situation that is horrific or, you know, devastating, something very very intense. That's that's a factor that determines the disintegrating effect of the traumatic experience. The duration, right? So something that is carried out over a long period of time, such as we saw in the case that we just looked at, because it was something that was going on over a long period of time. So that will gradually wear away at a person. And then also the repetition, right? So you can have something that in and of itself is perhaps you know, not so disintegrating. But if it happens over and over and over and over again, then it will have a disintegrating effect. And one example that Winnicott gives in his book Playing in Reality is basically X, Y, and Z dimensions of deprivation for the child. So basically, he talks about how so the child cries in the crib, and the absence of the mother triggers a certain feeling, yeah, and but then the mother comes after a few minutes and picks up the child, and the child is okay. Yeah, so that's the X dimension. The Y dimension is that the child is crying and it takes the mother a longer period of time to get there, and so the child is shaken up and it takes a longer time for the child to calm down, but then eventually the child is okay. And then the Z dimension is that the mother doesn't appear, yeah, because say the mother is going through her own struggles or whatever, and the child is just left crying and crying and crying. And that dimension, then, in Winnicott's understanding, leaves an indelible uh, impression, or as Genet says, a disintegrating effect. So the event in and of itself, um, is only impactful because of the duration of experience, yeah, and also the repetition. So say that this happens, that the child is left alone one time. Well, that's very different than if the child is left alone day after day after day after day with only occasional nurturance from the mother. Then, of course, that will have an impression. Um, Again, in the homeopathic understanding, that event in and of itself is only significant because of the state that it will elicit in the person. So you can imagine various scenarios here where, say, for example, um, a child who is exposed to this kind of situation or event then will become very violent, yeah, later in life as their reaction to this traumatic experience. But that tendency towards violence from the homeopathic understanding is already innately there in the person. Or the same child or a different child in the same situation might become, um, you can say, very afraid of other people. Yeah, afraid of other people, afraid of engaging in relationships, and they become a recluse. Or they might become falling into easy patterns of substance abuse and addiction. All of these things relate and reflect the person rather than the event, because that event, yes, it's a traumatic event, but that event in and of itself does not in any way determine how the person will react or respond to it. Just as we saw in this case of the divorce, how the feeling of then being in a cage when you're separated from your wife and your family is unique to the experience of that person. Yeah, there can be all kinds of other ways and all kinds of other experiences that people have. So that is, I think, one way of trying to understand what trauma is, and the factors that go into making trauma something significant in the person's life. But I really like this idea that the disintegrating effect of a trauma relates to the is proportional to the intensity, duration, and repetition. I think those are that's a very good insight. Um, and there are of course overlaps and overlays between shock, grief, and trauma. I mean, there is fundamentally, if you look at the etymology of the word trauma, which is very interesting, it comes from the Greek, and the word means a wound, a wounding, or piercing. That's the earliest root of the word trauma, and basically it refers to a perforation, which then leaves an indelible sign, like a scar on the skin. Yeah, and so, but it's interesting also the root of the word trauma, tr, yeah, that Indo-European root. We have all kinds of words uh, that are useful to understand in relation to trauma, like transformation, transpersonal, transition, transference, yeah, this whole idea, yeah. So it's very
Yeah.
interesting to consider the evolutionary importance for the individual of certain kinds of traumatic experiences that allow for a reconstellation of the person's life and understanding of themselves. Yeah. And that's also something that is given pride of place in homeopathic understanding, because you can see that through the traumatic experience that the person has, that they can be reborn through it. Yeah. And especially if you see a patient who has the same kinds of traumatic experiences over and over and over again that are happening through life, same patterns in relationships that are happening, same patterns of illness that are happening over and over again, then there's obviously something there that is asking to be attended to. And when it's attended to,
Yeah.
then the energy is liberated. The vital force is liberated such that the person is able to move beyond that state of stuckness. Yeah. But just to finish with the etymology of trauma, uh, basically the word means that, or it implies the possibility of repair, but afterwards the thing that is repaired will never be exactly the same. Yeah, the mark, the scar, the change is always henceforth visible in some way, but repair is possible. Yeah. So that's when you look at the Greek and the Latin etymology of the word trauma, that's the understanding that it gives us of a wound or a piercing that leaves an indelible sign that can be healed, but that the mark is always there. It's always visible.
Stays.
Yeah, it stays.
Yeah.
But that can be, and again, that's the sign of transformation. Can be when
Yes.
it's when that material is utilized, then it can be used for the greater work that the person has to undergo, as part of, you could say, their destiny. Yeah, and depending on your cosmology, arguably, if this is not dealt with in this life, then it will be dealt with in the next life. Or if it's not dealt with in
For
that life,
sure.
then it will keep coming back until it is dealt with.
There is no way out.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So, Victor, I'd like to actually talk about this remedy, Buddleja,
Okay.
which I saw on your Instagram, and it was just so fascinating. So this is what Victor has written about Buddleja, or at least this is what I found. For those in an emotional bomb site, for states of hypersensitivity which arise as a consequence of extreme shock, sudden loss, overwhelm, ruin. What else did you write?
It's considered a remedy for affecting healing in those who carry trauma from long ago. Yeah, it's been said by one of the provers of the remedy that symbolically it works on the level of primordial fear and terror, which reaches all the way back to humanity's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Yeah. So that says something about it being a very useful remedy in deep states of devastation. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we could use this as a nation. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
we really
Yeah,
could.
and so as an emotional first aid remedy, Buddleja is definitely up there.
Yeah.
And this was a remedy that, for example, was given to people who experienced the bombing of the Twin Towers in New York. This was one of the main remedies that was given for the shock that was experienced by those people who were very affected by it. And so sometimes, of course, you have situations in which, especially when you're dealing with a collective trauma, say you're dealing with thousands of people, you can't you can't individualize every case and spend several hours with every person. You have to be able to find in these kinds of situations remedies that can be given with a degree of reliability that will help. So you have, and this started with Hahnemann with various epidemic diseases, where he would take the totality, not of the one person, but of many people. So you take many cases, and this could be of trauma, but it could also be of a disease, yeah, like cholera, for example, or COVID. Homeopaths did the same thing during COVID. You take many cases and you treat them as if one person, and then from that you're able to derive a few remedies that fit the overall totality, not of the individual person but of the disease. And you can do this also with traumas. And certainly Buddleja would be a remedy if you were to do the kind of this genus traumaticus kind of approach in dealing with some kind of traumatic situation that affects many people. Well, you would look at as many cases as you could, see what the salient features are, and then you have, say, 3 or 4 remedies, and then it becomes much easier to reliably prescribe to larger groups of people with only having to do very short consultations. Yeah, so you can get a sense: are they in the Buddleja state? Are they in the Ignatia state? Are they in the Nat-Mir state? Because all of those remedies are fitting the overall the genus traumaticus or genus
Pattern.
epidemicus pattern. Yeah. So that's a way of then prescribing
Is
for
it
a larger group.
is it a remedy that we can keep in our first aid kit? And if so, how can we just take it?
Yeah, I think it is a good remedy to have in the first aid kit. Um, it would be definitely a remedy to consider if, for example, a person takes Ignatia for deep grief and a certain sudden grief that overcomes them. Say they lose a loved one, or they lose a pet, or something happens and they're overwhelmed with grief. Uh, and Ignatia is not doing anything. Ignatia is a very well-known remedy for this kind of state. Then Buddleja could certainly be considered. Buddleja is also, in terms of first aid, a very useful remedy to take if you're ever having to go in for a surgery or having to take a general anesthesia, because it significantly reduces the likelihood that you will suffer ill effects from taking the anesthesia.
That's
Yeah,
great.
and you do have people who say go in for some kind of dental procedure or other major surgery, and they have to be put under, and then they suffer for sometimes even months with these feelings of fogginess and ungroundedness and this kind of state after the anesthesia. And Buddleja is a very useful remedy to take before and right after the anesthesia, because it definitely helps significantly to lessen the effects of that. So
And
it's useful for that as well.
how long before the anesthesia would you say?
Um, if you could do it a few minutes before, that would be good, or half an hour. Half an
Okay.
hour is fine. Yeah, whatever works. I mean, because sometimes it's not so feasible to take it right before, but as soon as you can. Yeah,
Right. Okay. So as close to the anesthetic as
yeah,
possible.
yeah. Would be definitely a good remedy to keep in mind. There are other remedies as well, but Buddleja is definitely a very useful remedy for that. I mean, you can say that the person that will be most helped by Buddleja on a deep level, you often see a certain kind of a lot of kindness. They like to help. They like to solve the problems of other people. They tend to be very helpful, and they can often harbor a deep sense of guilt. Yeah, especially if they were not able to fulfill certain promises that they made. They can definitely feel a lot of guilt around that. But it's also a very important remedy for head injuries. Yeah. So if there's a head injury and you take arnica, which is well known for injuries to the head, but it doesn't always work in every case. Yeah, there are certain conditions for arnica to be a good remedy for that. So Buddleja is very definitely to be considered for head injuries, post accident, also for electrical shock, um, for traumas in hospitals. Yeah. So it's a useful remedy to have if you're going into the hospital for various reasons. And then also sudden shock. Yeah, like
Also, transitioning this life to the next, you said.
yes, it is one of the remedies that has been used for this purpose. Yeah, and so and I would say, especially if, for example, you see someone who's in a guilt state towards end of life, and they're
Right,
and
right,
they're and
right.
they're thinking about all the things that they failed at, and how they did everyone wrong, and oh, how I wasn't helpful enough, and oh, I should have been there for you when I wasn't. That would be really where Buddha would help. Yeah. So there are definitely, and not to say that if the patient didn't have that Buddha would not be a useful remedy, because it has the association with helping people transition
Okay.
into the afterlife. But there are other remedies that could also be used for that purpose. Um, this is a topic that is very interesting, but you do have sometimes situations in which you're treating basically these so-called terminal patients, and sometimes what can happen is that um, they're staying in a state of suffering, and with a good remedy, the suffering is relieved, and they actually end up passing more quickly. But it's because the only reason that they're still alive is because the suffering is keeping them here in this
Yeah,
life, and
yeah.
you give a remedy, and they're able to, in a sense, resolve the underlying conflict. And once that conflict is resolved, then they're able to pass more peacefully. I mean, sure, they pass maybe a few weeks or a few months before they otherwise would, but then they pass in a state of resolution. So it's actually, I would say, much to the patient's advantage.
Sure.
Yeah.
Victor, it's been extremely enlightening as always. And so thank you very much for being with me again. And I hope that we can have you on again in the
It
future.
would be my pleasure.
I'm sure I'll have.
There's lots to discuss. As you can see, there's so many avenues to explore,
Yes.
and I hope that the case was helpful to the listeners, because you can really get a sense from cases how the theoretical part makes sense, because you can have all kinds of wonderful theories about all kinds of things. But for me, especially coming from a background in philosophy, I mean, in a way, I felt like, yeah, philosophy only took me so far, because sometimes with philosophy you find yourself philosophizing just for the sake of philosophizing. And that praxis, that element, and praxis in the true meaning of the word means the relationship between theory and practice. Yeah, that's what a praxis is. It's that crux of the relationship. And with cases, you can really see how the beautiful and philosophically enriched theory of homeopathy does actually have a significant impact. And the theory is not just random, or it's not just a pure abstraction, which can be also something beautiful to see what the mind can create on its own. But to see that then the theory actually has an embodied realization is for me what makes homeopathy so beautiful. So
Well, thanks again, Victor. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope to see you again soon. Coming up,